Do you think the resurrected Jesus appearing to 500 was a mass hallucination?
Okay, so here's why I get in trouble on this one, okay? There's a difference between the centrality of something theologically and your ability to prove it historically. Those aren't the same things. And I think people sometimes have anxiety about that, but it's just obvious to me.
Why do you think Paul never got any firsthand accounts or interviews with the eyewitnesses of those 500?
Maybe he did. Maybe he knew half a dozen of them and had talked to them. The problem is we just don't know.
What is the most overlooked evidence validating Jesus' resurrection? Do you think the resurrected Jesus appearing to 500 was a mass hallucination?
Okay, so here's why I get in trouble on this one, okay? So, apologists are wont to say, well, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once, and that can't be a hallucination. But my response to that is not to say, well, it must have been a mass hallucination. It is to say, we have one sentence from the Apostle Paul saying this. We have no interviews with any of these people. We don't know the names of any of them. We don't know why 500 people were gathered together. Was this after people already had believed in Jesus? Probably. Was there an expectant mood? Was there a speaker who kind of worked them up? But the most important thing is that we have, in historical records, we have stories of people having sightings as a group of certain difficult to understand things. So, my favorite is a series of apparitions that took place in Zaytun in Egypt outside of Cairo in 1968, 69, 70, 71. And these apparitions, or whatever you want to call them, were seen by literally over hundreds of thousands of people over the course of years.
Mm.
Now, if you read Coptic Christian literature or talk to Coptic Christians, they will say in a single sentence, Mary appeared to tens of thousands of people. They all saw her, right? Or Mary appeared to over 100,000 people, including Muslims and Christians, including some secular skeptics. Okay, that's just a sentence. Does that settle it? Do you then say, that's it? I know? No, because we know, among other things, from interviews, because thousands of these people have sat for interviews over the years, that not everybody saw exactly the same thing. And there are differences in their testimony. And there are, at least for me, questions about what exactly is going on here. Now, I think it's an event very hard to debunk. I don't know how to give it a sort of skeptical analysis and wish it away. On the other hand, I'm not, uh, my theology doesn't know what to do with an appearance of Mary. So I say, well, I don't know exactly what it is, right? And if that's what I'm doing with this event, and we have some photographs, we have people who investigated it from year one, we have journalistic accounts, interviews with people while it's going on. We don't have any of that for the 5,000. So for me, this was probably evidential for Paul. I guess I should strike probably. It was evidential for Paul. Otherwise, he wouldn't state it. But he's not given us any of the details, and we don't have them. So if you are a skeptic or you aren't motivated to believe or don't want to believe, you're not going to do anything with that. That is one sentence from a guy who's, from a skeptic's point of view, biased and pre-enlightenment and on and on and on. You're not going to take that and say, well, that proves something. You're going to say, I don't have enough data to infer something from this. Now, I got to be careful here because there's a difference between thinking within the church or thinking theologically and then thinking in a public space. And what I'm giving to you right now is reflections within the public space. So a sentence claiming that Jesus appeared to 500 isn't going to do anything more for a skeptic or an unbeliever than some claim that Mary appeared, at Fatima or wherever it is, just a one sentence account. Uh, on the other hand, I do think that Zaitun is really interesting for the skeptic because I think it shows you that there are amazing events that happen that aren't so easily explained, or at least I don't know what the heck we're supposed to do with it. So, uh, again, people don't like me on this topic because I say I don't think this is proof for somebody who doesn't already believe it. On the other hand, I don't think you can simply dismiss everything that you can't just say I think it was a hallucination. You can't do that with Zaitun. You just can't do it. So it's just you're projecting your prejudice onto the accounts. So I have to say there, uh, the historian just has to say, well, this is an interesting claim, and then look at other things. I should also say here that um, I am not a typical Christian apologist with regard to the resurrection. Now, what that means is that there are friends of mine, apologists, who will say if you just take into account facts 1, 2, 3, and 4, the resurrection of Jesus is the only hypothesis or theory that really takes care of the facts. I'm less. um I'm not confident that they are right at all. So in my book, on the very first page, I say I think Jesus rose from the dead and that he saw the disciples as well as, them seeing him. But that doesn't mean I can prove this with 3 or 4 historical probabilities or facts. So for me, for me, Christianity is a sort of worldview, and the resurrection fits within it or functions within it. It's not a sort of epistemological grounding where if you come at 3 or 4 facts with an unprejudiced mind, you'll be able to construct Christianity. So epistemologically, I'm not a foundationalist. Uh, you know,
Yeah, I guess that's the challenge. I mean, specifically with this, because it was a statement, one sentence, I believe. It was only in Corinthians. I don't think it was
yes,
in
it's
any
only in
other.
1 Corinthians
Yeah,
15.
it's only in First Corinthians, and there's a lot that we're gonna unpack with that. But I guess it is one of those things that, well, maybe skeptics can take a look at it and say, well, I can't debunk it, but I also can't prove it. So I guess I'm just gonna disregard it. It's like a tricky subject, but I still do believe, and that's why we're doing this interview, that there's something to learn and take away from there. But let me ask you, if that verse was taking out, where specifically First Corinthians chapter 15, that just never existed. Like, he never said that Jesus appeared to over 500. Would that change at all the validity of the resurrection or the resurrected Christ?
If we didn't have that little section in 1 Corinthians
Yeah.
15, no, because I think that we can do a lot of historical work with the Gospels, with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I think as an historian, now again, there are people who disagree with me, but I think as an historian, I can say that Jesus was probably buried and probably buried by some guy named Joseph of Arimathea, and that his tomb was probably found empty soon after he was laid to rest. The Gospels also indicate that Jesus appeared to individuals and to groups. So we would have all of that even without 1 Corinthians 15. But maybe, again, maybe you're looking for too much here. So I'm an ancient historian. And let's say, for example, let's just say that Mark 5 happened and Jesus showed up once and a bunch of pigs ran over a cliff.
Uh-huh.
Let's say that it really happened.
Uh-huh.
How do you prove it? How do you prove that a textual thing like that happened? And that's a remarkable thing. The resurrection is even more remarkable. So I'm sort of the opinion that what we have in modern apologetics is sort of a product of the Enlightenment, where you have skeptics say, "Oh, I can disprove this. It must have been hallucinations, or the disciples were frauds, or whatever." And then the response to this is, "No, this must be the most certain fact of all, and we can prove it." But there's a difference between the centrality of something theologically and your ability to prove it historically. Those aren't the same things. And I think people sometimes have anxiety about that, but it's just obvious to me. I don't think God, for example, is the product of an historical argument. You can't say, well, these 3 facts or these 4 facts I can establish, and therefore there is a God. Lots of other things are involved. So one of my intellectual heroes is a 3rd century church father named Origen. And Origen at one point says, and he was right, one of the most difficult things to do is to prove that something happened, even if it did. And one of the most difficult things to do is prove something didn't happen, even if it didn't happen. He's right. This is really difficult. And if you spend your life as an historian, you know how difficult it is. Uh, People make claims all the time that upon investigation turn out to be half true or not true at all. You know that there are legends. You know that there are myths. You know that there are urban legends, right? There are myths in our own time. You know that there is debate right now as to what news stories you can believe,
Yep.
even when it would seem people could inspect the facts and come to a safe conclusion. So you just have to, at least from my point of view, be conscious of the difficulty of establishing uh, astounding historical claims.
Yeah.
Um, I do believe in certain astounding events, and I do believe certain astounding claims. But if I'm giving credence to the skeptic and to the skeptic within me, I have to say that certain arguments just don't bowl me over. And a simple appeal to the 500 or trying to extrapolate from it, you know, 30 things that you really know happened has never made sense to me. I just don't think we know uh, much about this.
Yeah. Not to I don't know if you've ever paid any mind to this. You probably have. But why do you think Paul never got any firsthand accounts or interviews with the eyewitnesses of those 500?
How do you know? Maybe he did. Maybe he knew half a dozen of them and had talked to them. The problem is we just don't know. So that's possible. I do wonder about the Corinthians because I think if some of these people were known to the Corinthians, he might have said, among whom are Sarah and Fred, whom you know well, or something like that. But he doesn't. And since he doesn't, I'm hesitant to think that they knew these people or that they traveled around the Mediterranean giving their testimonies. Uh, but look, Paul knows a million things that aren't in his letters. We simply have a small collection of letters written to churches on this occasion or that occasion, usually responding to some bad or concerning news.
Yeah.
And Paul nowhere does Paul say, okay, now I'm going to tell you everything I know about Jesus, or I'm going to tell you about everything I know about what happened on Easter morning and so on. He just doesn't do that. He quotes a little creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and he elaborates on it a little bit, but then he goes on to do his understanding of resurrection for everybody else. And there's nowhere else in his letters where he sits down and says, oh, okay, this is what I know happened. But that's not unusual. He only quotes Jesus half a dozen times. He must have known more than 6 sayings of Jesus. He never refers to a single miracle story, not a single one. It's impossible. He didn't know some of those stories. It's ridiculous. Of course, he knew some of these stories. I think he knew those stories, some of them before he was a Christian, because before he has his experience on the Damascus Road, he is opposing Christians, according to his own testimony, persecuting Christians. That means he has to have discussions with them. He has to know what they're saying. He has to know some of their beliefs. He already has engagement with these people and their stories before Jesus appears to him on the Damascus Road. So
Yeah.
he has to know all sorts of things, all sorts of things. You could take one of my books, doesn't matter, one of my books that is longer than all of Paul's letters put together.
Mhm.
And you could say, is this everything Dale Allison knows? Well, that would be ridiculous. I put in one book what is appropriate to that one book. And Paul puts into his letters what's appropriate for those letters.
Yeah.
If the Corinthians hadn't messed up the Lord's Supper, right? Then you wouldn't have a chapter in First Corinthians on this. And there's no reference to the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper anywhere else in Paul. If they hadn't messed up, you would have no evidence that this was an important Pauline ritual, that he knew about it, that he knew that Jesus was betrayed in the night, that he's got some narrative context for this event. You would know none of it. And of course, then you would have skeptical historians saying, well, Paul, he didn't know anything about the Last Supper because it's not in his letters. It's just an argument from silence. And you have to be really, really, really careful there.
Yeah,
Okay?
that's actually I've never thought about it that way. That's a very interesting take, and I hope that somebody watching this like really takes heart to that because that's very interesting. And I guess it also to add to that, I don't know if it was in Revelations or maybe the end of John, the Gospel of John. I don't remember what it was, but um whoever the writer was, I paraphrasing, but he wrote that there's not a book that can contain the amount of events
Well,
and miracles
yeah.
and words that Jesus Christ. So I think, and again, this is the balance and this never-ending balance of not relying solely on logic. It's like if somebody were to say, "Well, I don't have any spirit and I don't have any soul." It's like, well, I mean, you can't prove that you have a spirit, but I guess there's evidence that you do have a spirit and you do have a soul because there's a lot of things unexplainable. And then the other person is like, "Well, no, I'm only spirit." It's like, well, no, you also have a body. You can't just you can touch yourself and you feel pain. Like you can't deny you have a body. And I feel
Uh-huh.
like it's the same thing with approaching this. I guess if you look at it purely from a logical perspective, it's like, well, you'll never find the truth. And that's why nobody has to this time in the modern age that we live, nobody 100% can prove how any of this happened. Morality, Jesus appearing to 500, like there's a reason for that. But the way that you explained it makes a lot of sense.
But
And go ahead, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say that everybody has an agenda. So I started off saying that I try to be aware of my confirmation bias.
Mhm.
But everybody working on this question has a confirmation bias. And uh, you just have to realize this. Nobody is coming at this question in terms of pure logic.
Yeah,
Most of the skeptics, I think this is fair. I know some of them don't want this to be true, right? They don't want this to be true. And in fact, most of the skeptics of my acquaintance are reacting against a sort of fundamentalist Christianity that they grew up with or that they were influenced by
interesting.
at some
So
point.
that in
So
itself
they,
is a bias because they're just
of course,
distasted from, okay, that makes sense.
so a skeptic can say, "I'm unbiased," but often, if you look into a personal history, you will see, no, there's some desire here, just as there is with people who go to church. There's a desire to find some meaning in the resurrection of Jesus and some reason to think, I hope it wasn't just a bunch of people hallucinating, right? That's not what you want to hear. But the point there would be there's bias on both sides. That's why in this book, I try to the best of my ability to engage in public arguments, by which I mean I give reasons for things that I think people outside the churches or inside the churches should be able to understand and follow, right? Uh, so, that's how I'm trying to,
Yeah.
deal with this.
And I always had an interview with Dr. Shermer, maybe like 2 weeks ago, Michael Shermer. And
Uh-huh.
one of the questions that I asked him that I don't think whenever it's atheists getting interviewed, or skeptics, or agnostics, or whatever it may be, like, they're never really asked that. Well, you just said, well, is there any bias that you have? So one of the questions I asked them was, you know, is there anything that give you a distaste to Christianity that maybe has led you on this mission? Because it's evident of, like, what is the mission for Christians. The mission is to make disciples of all nations. The mission is that you believe to your core that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, that he is the redeemer of sins. But I don't know what the mission for skeptics and, atheists are. Is it just to debunk? And that's one of the questions I asked him, which was interesting, his response. But I don't know. That's just something that I've been learning, that I guess
So
everybody does have a bias.
So yeah, everyone has a bias. I don't know his history. I don't
Yeah.
know him personally. I've never spoken with him, but I can tell you that many people have really bad experiences in very conservative churches, and
Yeah.
then
And
they
it's
they
sad.
leave
Yeah.
home, they go off to college, they discover a new world, and then they can be embarrassed by their past, right? They can be embarrassed by it,
Yeah.
and being a skeptic is a way of dealing with their embarrassment and proving their parents or their pastor wrong and justifying their own decision to leave behind what that was.
Yeah.
My own experience is totally different. Um, I've never been around real fundamentalists, people that are really, really, really way more conservative than I am, way, way off to the right. Uh, Most of the people I've been around have been good Christian folks. I just haven't had this bad experience in churches. My
Yeah.
church experiences have been all good, right? I've also had the great good fortune of knowing several wonderful, marvelous, exceptional Christian people. So those things make Christianity attractive to me, right?
Mhm.
Especially these individuals that I've known who lived as Christians and seem to me admirable in so many ways. So I don't have that. My
Yeah.
bias is the other way, right? But I
Yeah.
have to admit I have a bias.
No, of
Again,
course.
I don't want my religion just to be empty.
Yeah, 100%. And speaking about skeptics and First Corinthians, I wanted to get your take on Bart Ehrman's claim. For First Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, I'll say it for the viewers watching. And it says, where Paul says, I passed on to you what was most important. And I was reading a book that Bart published. I don't remember the name of the book, but he pretty much said that Paul saying this is claiming that he is not a firsthand witness of the 500, or Jesus appearing to the 500, but more so somebody that saw Jesus appear to the 500s is telling Paul, and Paul is just, relaying and saying, oh, well, somebody told me this, thus I'm going to tell you. What are your thoughts on that claim?
Well, so I don't know the passage you're referring to or the interview that you're referring to. Again, if you're talking about the 500, Paul doesn't say I was one of them.
Yes.
So I don't think he was there on the occasion, which means if he knows about this, he has to know it at second hand or third hand. If there are 500 people, the early church isn't that big. He probably does know or has talked with somebody who was there. That would be my guess. It's my guess in part because my own historical critical analysis of the creed that's there in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. I think Paul probably added the 500 and probably added his own experience to the end of it. So I think Paul is adding it. I can't prove that. It's just the way I read the Greek. But um, I don't see how you could get a first person from that. Now he does know. You know this from Galatians. You also know this from Acts, that he has talked to people that we think of as belonging to the 12. He knows Peter. He knows John. He knows James, who is presumably the brother of Jesus. He knows these people. And he's had conversations with Peter, and Jesus appears to Peter. And he's had conversations with James, and there's an appearance to James. So he has talked to people who have had encounters or claimed encounters with Jesus. He also has his own encounter. So I don't know how he could be firsthand about anything other than his own experience, but I don't think his knowledge of James and Peter is third or fourth or fifth hand. I think it's secondhand, if that's the right word, because he's talking to them himself, right? And in Galatians, he says he went up to Jerusalem and he spent some time with these people, and there was a famous New Testament scholar named C.H. Dodd, and his comment on this getting together in Jerusalem was he was sure they didn't talk about the weather, by which he meant they obviously would have been talking about things that happened to Jesus and what they had seen and experienced and so on. And that has to be the case. So I don't regard 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following as something like a folk tale or an urban legend. I think it's informed by Paul's um, discussions, conversations with some of the people involved. So I'm not sure what Bart was saying, because I don't know that he would disagree with what I just said. I'm not sure how anybody could disagree with what I just said. So maybe
Yeah.
I've misunderstood something Bart said.
Well, yeah. Well, what I was saying is that he said that that is showing that Paul, because a lot of people claim that Paul was one of amongst the 500. At least some.
Oh,
It's very skewed. But I'm saying Bart claimed that Paul was not firsthand. That it was
okay.
somebody firsthand who. So it's the same thing that you're saying.
Yeah, I
And
don't think Paul was one of the 500. If he was, I think he would have said so.
yeah, that does make sense. I
And 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 going back to my earlier point, even if he was, he doesn't say so. So how would we know it?
yeah. I it's just one of those things for Christians and followers of Christ that, and a lot of evangelists use that as well. Well, they say, Muslims always bring up the argument that Jesus was never crucified, which I think that is a discussion in its own. And the rebuttal to everything is always, well, he appeared to 500, he appeared to 500, he appeared to 500. And it's an interesting topic because, again, it's like, I don't know if we'll ever get to the place and time where we could prove that he actually appeared to 500, but I also don't think we could ever get to the place where it's completely unprovable. And I think
No,
skeptics
no.
that completely disregard this and
You,
say, "Oh, well,
you
he
just
wasn't the
have
first," and
you just have to say origin was right. If it happened, you can't always prove that it happened. And he's right about it. Most of the things that have happened to me in my life, I can't go back and prove. They're just in my memory, right? I like to think my memory is accurate, but I know it's inaccurate about some things. Uh, but most historical events are long gone, and it's really difficult to reconstruct the past. That's why historians disagree about all sorts of things. Historians disagree about the character of Abraham Lincoln, uh, and we have all sorts of documents, right, concerning Abraham Lincoln that we don't have about Jesus and the first Christians. We have contemporary records. We have speeches spoken by him, and so on. Anyway, I just want to emphasize that I think as a historian, this is a lot harder than people often imagine. And I don't like Christians using bad arguments. If they're going to use arguments, they should use good arguments. And I don't think you can get what they think they can out of this 500 thing. I just ask them what they do with appearances of Mary, where you can find millions of sentences. This many people saw Mary. That doesn't solve it. What lies behind that? You just can't do it unless you want to, and you're sure everything Paul said must be 100% true because it's in scripture and so on.
well, I
In
guess
other
that,
words, your
yeah,
arguments are going to be assuming premises that your opponent doesn't share. So the arguments aren't any good.
yeah. Food for thought. I was just thinking about it. I don't know. I was thinking about it. Like, imagine if there was cameras back then and everything was just recorded and would have 100% proof. And then I just thought about it now because 200 years down the road, I don't know where AI will be, but I definitely believe that I don't even think you'd be able to trust a video, even if you see it. And it's just
Oh,
crazy
yeah.
where history. I don't know where history is gonna lie because, the saying that history is always told by the victors. I don't know how it's gonna work with AI. I was just thinking about that because if cameras existed back then, we could say, "Oh, well, look, this happened. There's a video of Jesus appearing to 500. It happened." And now it's like, well, AI can kind of make that video. So is it true? Is it not true? Just something I was thinking about. And in your opinion, what is the most overlooked evidence validating Jesus' resurrection?
Well, I don't know that anybody's asked me that question before. Therefore, I haven't thought about it at great length. Therefore, I probably shouldn't hazard an answer, but I can tell you what pops into my head.
Please.
I'm really interested in the fact that in Matthew 28, it says that some doubted when Jesus appeared. You remember that?
Yes.
And then in
Well, Thomas
John,
primarily, right?
pardon? It,
Thomas was
it, j-
one of the main doubters that he was like,
well,
"I have
so,
to
and
touch
then
him
in the
to."
Gospel of John, in chapter 20, you have the story of Thomas.
Mhm.
Then in Luke's uh, a story of Jesus appearing more than once. You have people who don't recognize him while he's with them. And then you have the disciples also having their doubts and Jesus having to sort of prove himself. And in the longer ending of Mark, it also says that they doubted. This motif of doubt, I do not think was invented. I don't think it was invented. Like, let's make sure we tell people that some of the disciples doubted. I think it's an original part of the tradition. And what it tells me is two things. One, it tells me that I think these go back to real events and experiences. And the second thing is it tells me that I don't think these people were completely naive about everything, because some of them were wondering what the heck is going on, or what did I just see, or what was this?
Yeah.
So I think the note of doubt is not a later literary embellishment. I think it probably contains a memory that goes back to people and shows you that they were thinking. By the way, I don't know what your worldview is, but one of the things that you notice frequently with people when something very strange or unusual or weird happens, they
Mhm.
instantly begin to question themselves. And what did I really see that? Was that really there? Did that really
Yeah.
happen? It's just completely normal. And so this feels like something that grows out of real experience. So it's not something that Christian apologists like to dwell on. They might even feel uncomfortable. Oh, some of them didn't doubt. They doubted. They weren't over bold. But it sounds to me bold. It
Mhm.
sounds to me like a real memory.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I would love to get your thoughts on this too because, as, obviously but, um, I just recently read it now, and, I think it was all the gospels have this, or maybe it was just the last 2, maybe it was Matthew, I don't remember, and he was walking with the disciples, or 2 of the disciples, and
Yeah,
they didn't
that's Luke.
Luke, okay, so they didn't recognize him, and
Yeah.
how do you what do you make of that? That their own disciples didn't recognize him? Like, does that mean that he just came in a different he looked different? Like, what do you inference from that?
So the Gospel of Mark in the edition, what's called pseudo Mark sometimes, says he appeared in a different form. It's an attempt
Mm,
to explain what's going on. But Mary Magdalene also doesn't recognize him at
yeah.
first, right? So uh, my thoughts on this have been informed by the fact that the commentaries, especially in the last 300 or 400 years, when they attempt to explain why Jesus isn't recognized, they
Yes.
come up with really stupid ideas. So I remember running across one commentator who said the two disciples on on the Emmaus Road didn't recognize Jesus because he was wearing a new set of clothes. I found another that said, well, they were walking behind him, off to the left and right flank, a little behind him, so they couldn't look him full in the face. Or Mary must not have recognized him because she has tears in her eyes, so it was all blurry and so on. What they're doing is they're thinking of Jesus as though he's exactly like you and me and should be immediately recognized when people encounter him because there's no difference between the pre and post Easter Jesus. I think these stories are a lot stranger than that. I think the way to read the Gospel of John, uh, chapter 20, is that Jesus pops in and out. Now, you can't do that. You can't pop in a room and you can't just pop out. I think he's really strange. Also, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, the way it tells the story, the women arrive at the tomb, then the stone is rolled away. There's an angel there, and then they go in and there's no Jesus. That means he's disappeared before the stone has been rolled away. What does that mean? It means he's popped into another dimension, or it means he's not like you and me. So I think the resurrected Jesus is strange and weird and different, and that the memory of these stories indicates that. So, I don't know what to do more than that. I don't know what to say more than that. But I think the old explanations and the commentaries are just really strange and mundane and unimaginative. And it's because they're not thinking that Jesus is in some way really different, is in a new state of being. The Gospels also, they tell the story of the transfiguration, where Jesus, even before the resurrection, is turned into something not his normal self, right? He's glowing. I don't know what that's all about, but I just think that it's really unimaginative to imagine that Jesus is just like me. I couldn't pop in and out of the room in John 20. I couldn't walk through rock or disappear into another dimension or whatever's going on in Matthew 28 doesn't tell you, but if you read between the lines, it's got to, unless there's a back door or a cellar. Uh, it, yeah, it doesn't seem like it. He's doing something else. So I think Christians need to uh, acknowledge the weirdness of what's going on there. Uh, was it Tom Wright who used the term transphysicality? Right. So yeah, it's just not the normal you and me, whatever this is. That's my take anyway.
For sure. Sure you've heard it before, and you kind of briefly kind of answered it, but just wanted to ask you directly, what's your, you know, your thought process when skeptics claim, well, if his own disciples that, lived with him for 3 years, if his own disciples that ate with him, if his own disciples knew exactly who you look like. I mean, even if I had a twin and you live with me for 3 years, you're not gonna be like, oh, that's Jacob. Like, no, that, like, who I am. And skeptics use that as saying, well, his own disciples didn't recognize him. You know, how could that be Christ if his own people didn't recognize him? I mean, what do you think
Well,
when
so I do think that the disciples, the 12, decided that this was Jesus. Peter does. He lives the rest of his life out as a Christian. Paul decided that he had seen Jesus. He equated this figure with the man he'd heard about. So, look, you can always play both sides. So, the skeptical argument that you just generated, yeah, it will have some force to a skeptic. But I started out here talking about how I think that the motif of doubt actually tells us that there are real experiences going on here, and that this is natural human psychology. It's exactly what you would expect. You wouldn't expect, oh, I know everything. I've seen this guy, and that's it. I'm sure of this. It's presented as an extraordinary event, and so doubt attends it. Look, you're not going to prove anything by um, throwing these sorts of arguments around. You're just presenting scenarios that fit one view or the other. And I think that's often what we're doing. We're just inventing scenarios that fit with one view or the other. And that's because I think we have to admit that when it comes to just plain historical evidence, this is not a sort of knock you down case. You can't deny the existence of Abraham Lincoln. That's different than wondering about the resurrection of Jesus if you're not within the church. They're just different things in my judgment. It's way easier to say, historically, one of the United States presidents was named Abraham Lincoln. That's way easier than saying, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. It just is. Even if Jesus rose from the dead is way more important theologically, but that's different than evaluating it historically.
Yes, and I also what do you think about this? Because I had a conversation with a man that had a crazy testimony. I mean, you're talking about a guy that he was literally stealing on video. Like his thing on Instagram 5 years ago was stealing and robbing people on camera for entertainment of the others, and now has
Okay.
come to Christ. And he said something that was very powerful, and I never thought about it before, which is why I enjoy what I do because you learn new things every single interview at every from everybody that I talk with. He said, "Well, it's similar to what you just said. It's very easy to prove Julius Caesar. Nobody doubts, the existence of Julius Caesar. Nobody doubts the existence of Abraham Lincoln. Nobody doubts their existence. But when it comes to Christ, and maybe not his existence, but his resurrection, specifically, people say, oh, well, no, that didn't happen. And I think part of it is because it calls for true change. Like if you actually take heart of the gospel and the message of the gospel, it it's not a message that if you were to internalize and really read, that you could be the same person, because then you didn't read it correctly or you didn't interpret it correctly, because the gospel and everything throughout it is Jesus came to be an atonement for our sins, and he is the mediator to God that once was needed through the priest or once was needed through a bloodshed of an animal, but now he has came and he's calling us countless times in the Bible, take up your cross and follow me, deny yourself, who can understand the heart is deceitful above all else, like all these different things that do you think people also don't want to believe in the resurrected Christ because they understand that there's change that comes with it?
Well, that may be. Maybe they know the Sermon on the Mount and don't want to try to live it. Uh, so maybe it helps here to draw an analogy. So let's just say there's somebody out there named Fred Smith,
Yeah.
and Fred Smith dies this week, and Fred Smith has lived an average life. Let's just say Fred has been a plumber, and he spent his evenings watching television, and he never had any kids, and he's a bit of a grumpy neighbor. But uh, there's some people at his funeral, and during his funeral, after let's make this really weird. After he's been embalmed, during the service, he wakes up, stands in front of his casket, and he says, "I've just risen from the dead." Okay, now that would be fascinating. Scientists would want to investigate this. A lot of us would think this must be a hoax, right? But we would be able to evaluate it without any religious ideas. We would just say, did this happen? Because if you believe Fred Smith rose from the dead, it's just a scientific issue. It
Yeah.
involves nothing else at all. Fred didn't say this, that, and the other thing and make certain demands. With Jesus, uh, you can't separate the the resurrection stories from who he is. In fact, it doesn't make any sense. Uh, God raises Jesus from the dead, and Jesus is the guy in the Gospels, right? So the whole thing is a sort of package. It would just be Fred Smith otherwise. So yeah, people, uh, of course, uh, if look, if somebody tomorrow could somehow prove to you that the Book of Mormon was copied from the golden plates that, an angel had showed Joseph,
Yeah.
well, you wouldn't say hallelujah. You would say there's got to be some problem here, wouldn't you? You would work really hard because you don't want to be a Mormon, I assume,
Well, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I think if that were to actually occur and happen, because I also I get presented like a lot of examples, and I say, well, also the likelihood of that happening is slim to none. But if it were to happen, I think I would still not automatically with anything, especially Christianity. Now that I'm a Christian, like I don't automatically say, "Oh, well, this is true." I guess it takes some sort of, you know, just seeking understanding, because I wholeheartedly believe that exactly what you said, that there is a loving God, and if God wants us to know Him, I don't think God doesn't want us to know. I don't think God is here in secret and saying, "Oh, well, I don't want you guys to know me, because if you guys know me, you're." No, I think God wants us to know Him, and that's why, I really do take to heart all things that Christ says, where He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," because there's nobody that has ever made that claim, and it's such a distinctive claim that I think if that were to occur, that you would always end up at the truth, and I guess that version of the truth is Christ to me.
Yeah.
But I don't know
Well,
if what you would
so
think to
yeah,
that.
you're waxing theological there, but I think you could just make that in terms of common sense. That is, uh, if something extraordinary happens to a particular individual,
Yeah,
you have to ask what else do you know about that individual, right?
yeah,
And this individual has been associated with a religion. And so when people are thinking about this, they may well be thinking, I don't want that religion to be true, or I don't want to convert to that religion. Uh, and, even if they're not a member of that religion, they're going to have conceptions about it, right?
yeah,
You have conceptions about Buddhism, even though you're not a Buddhist,
yeah,
right? So that's just always the case with people. It'd be really tough to find somebody in our society who had no idea what Christianity was, didn't have any idea about
yeah.
it, whether fair or not. By the way, a lot of people in our society um, have really distorted views of Christianity because maybe all they know is what they've seen on some weird TV channels or what they've heard on some weird radio programs. And if that's
Um,
all they know, why in the heck would they want to, join up with that cause? I wouldn't.
uh, it's it's definitely tricky, because I see that, and that's what one of my motivators is, that I think there's also the flip side of it, where, like we were talking about earlier, and people that are purely logic, and people that are like purely, no, Christianity, Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and life. I was born a Christian. I'm gonna die a Christian. I'm not gonna explore any other religion. Like, this is the truth. That's it. I mean, I guess, but that's kinda like a cult-like mentality. If it's like, I'm not looking at anything else, like, this is the thing I'm not gonna learn, you know?
So I don't like that at all. In fact, one of the weird things about my book is I have a chapter on, which you may have noticed, I have a chapter on these Tibetan stories about rainbow bodies and what happens to them. So uh, yeah, I just don't understand that mentality. The world is
Mhm.
big. I don't know that much. I should always be learning. I should always be learning as much as I
Yes.
can about everything, I think. Uh,
Yeah, I think that's the that if anything, should be taken to heart, like, to be a never-ending student, and which is something that I admire about you, and I'm very grateful for this conversation, because the thing I admire most about you is that you're in this never-ending pursuit of understanding and being a student of what it is that you do. Like, I think that's so needed and so important, because without it, it's kind of like you might as well die if you're not learning, if you're not actually seeking for more understanding. And it's never ending, yes, but there's also a fulfilling aspect of it. But I wanted to end off with a question that I don't think that you've ever been asked, or at least I haven't seen in your interviews,
okay.
and goes back to the beginning of what we were saying. But what is you? I mean, outside in, people look at you, oh, well, you're Princeton professor, you graduated from here, you've written X amount of books, you're very smart, you're intelligent, you're a historian, you're all these different things, you know, but on the personal side, what has Jesus done for your life, or how has he changed your life?
Well, I've obviously been obsessed with him because I've written a number of books, and every time I've written a book, I thought that'll be my last one on this character. And I just had another one come out a week or two ago, so I can't get away from him. But one way to think about this is that Jesus is different things for me. One is I think of Jesus as my conscience. And by this I'm not saying I want Jesus to be my conscience or Jesus should be my conscience. I'm just saying that he is my conscience because somehow over the years I've internalized the Sermon on the Mount. So that voice of the Sermon on the Mount is always speaking to me. All right. It's always there. It's not what I should do. It's just a fact. So this guy speaks to me. And then forever, I've been fascinated by Mark 14, 15 through 16. This is the Passion narrative. This is the story of this guy going up to Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, this Last Supper, the agony of Gethsemane, the arrest, the crucifixion, the death, and the burial. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to explain it, but that story simply captivates me. All right. It captivates me. And I think this is really, really, really profound. And I can spend my whole life thinking about this. Jesus is also the guy who speaks those parables in the Gospel of Luke, like the rich man and Lazarus or the Good Samaritan. These parables are also part of me. So years ago, I remember being out in the country in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and I could see that somebody up on the road was waving. They were by what looked like a broken down car, right? And I had read some story not that long ago about, you know, somebody that was attacked by the side of the road because they stopped to lend a hand. And what happened to me is I remember the story of the Good Samaritan. And I actually ended up stopping. And I stopped because that story was there, because Jesus was speaking to me. All right. And uh now I could go on and on. I'm not giving you a simple one sentence thing. I'm telling you that Jesus has functioned this way for me. And the story of the end of his life also functions the same way. Death followed by resurrection, which has to be the paradigm for all of us, I think, because we're all going to die. And throughout our lives, we suffer terribly. Everybody I've ever known suffers horribly. And you have to live with this death, this suffering, death, and resurrection paradigm. I'm also extremely attracted to Jesus because in some sense, people don't like to hear this, but in some sense, he's otherworldly. He frequently talks about judgment, and he talks about Gehenna, and he talks about the future and the resurrection and the kingdom of God. And uh, I don't know how to live life without those ideas, without that hope, without rethinking all of those texts. So maybe the short way to say this, I haven't been very eloquent, is that these texts have become part of who I am. I don't know they are who I am. I don't know how to be anything else. So I I pray the Jesus prayer, every morning, and then I go to work. And Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. The old famous prayer. So maybe that's part of the answer that you're looking for.
Oh, I think it is. Everybody has a unique way of answering it because our life with Christ is different. Everybody has different walk
Uh-huh.
with Christ, but nonetheless, I think that it is real, and especially how you described it, it's real because it's real to you, and it is real because His Word is alive, and I believe so. Because if it wasn't, I don't think that you know exactly what you said, that you can't see yourself living a life without this word being implanted in your heart and your mind. But again, I thank you because really did enjoy this conversation. And is there anything that you would like to promote? Any new? I know you said you had a new book that came out a week ago.
Uh, yeah, but I don't know. So the resurrection book, I'm perfectly happy to plug that. But of my recent books, the one I care most about is a book called Encountering Mystery.
Yeah.
And if, if you're at all interested about the person behind the scholarship, this is a book that does that. It actually begins with some of my personal experiences and then broadens out to sort of journalistic report
Uh-huh.
about all the odd things that really do happen in the world. And it includes an analysis of these things. So that's the book that in recent years that I'm probably the most happy with.
Yeah.
And it's also probably the book that is understandable to the to a wider audience than usual.
Yeah.
So parts of this book on the resurrection are a bit academic, right?
Yeah.
And it's got some Greek and Hebrew in it and so on. This is a book for a wider audience.
Awesome. Well, I'll link that in the description. Again, thank you, Dr. Allison, for taking the time to do this.
Thank you.